How's everybody doing? Good? Okay. So warning, I've had a lot of caffeine today. So I'm probably going to go kind of at warp speed. There's also a lot of stuff that I want to go through, but I hear that it's being recorded, so I think you guys will have access to it later, and if you have any questions, we'll either leave some time at the end or just come and find me. So the thing we're going to talk about today, obviously, is marketing growth for B2B enterprise. But before we kind of dig into that, what does enterprise really mean? And I feel like that's sort of a muddy thing right now, and there's a lot of different definitions of enterprise. So, quiz time. Does it mean over $1 billion in revenue? Does it mean over 1,000 employees? Or is it a made-up term by a marketer so that they could charge more money? Any ideas? How many people say A? How many people say B? How many people say C? That's amazing. So if you Google this, you'll actually get like all of those responses, right? So like some people will tell you, oh, it's anybody over $1 billion, and other people will tell you, oh, it's over 1,000 employees. But there's not a lot of companies that are 1,000 employees that have already hit $1 billion, right? So there's a bit of a disparity there. And then of course, some people will tell you it's a made-up term for us to charge more money. At the end of the day, when you look at what enterprise customers or clients are, it just means really, really big business or company, right? So how we define that is a little bit different depending on your model and your market and who it is that you're going after. So typically, here's what I see, right? Typically, you've got sort of three segments, broadly speaking. A lot of people will talk about small business, they'll talk about mid-market, they'll talk about enterprise. They'll call this SMB, right? So you've got the small part, you've got the mid-market part in the M. And this is where it starts to get a little bit murky in terms of actually selling and marketing to buyers. Whether you're in mid-market or actual enterprise sales, there's a lot of similarities there. And I would actually suspect that a lot of people in this room probably aren't talking to the $1 billion plus, right? Probably we're talking somewhere around mid-market or even upper mid-market. So if you really, 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 really want a revenue number, there's one, maybe, sort of, kind of. But 0 to 10 million is a pretty massive range, right? A company making $1 million is totally different than a company making $10 million. A company making 10 million is totally different than a $1 billion company. So the idea here is that we need to think about how much that actually matters, right? And it does matter when we're looking at restructuring our marketing and our sales process, taking a look at what a revenue funnel is, understanding how people buy. But the reality is you need to look at more than just size. Size doesn't matter. It matters a little bit, obviously, because that's why we're here and we're talking about it. I had to really resist, by the way, putting up a super inappropriate slide here. I kind of feel like I should have, but the reality is you need to look at your market within a whole bunch of different dimensions. So what's different about enterprise marketing, right? And I'm going to kind of give that a bit of a caveat, not just enterprise, but also mid-market. So I'm going to go through this kind of fast. I think you guys know this stuff. It's pretty basic stuff. The sales cycles are typically longer, right? And generally speaking, the more money they're putting down, the more complex the solution is, and the bigger they are, the longer the sales cycle. I spoke to somebody about a month ago. They had a 4-year sales cycle. It was $1 million ACV, but a 4-year sales cycle, right? But then, at Uberflip, we were looking around the 90-day mark. At Shopify, we're roughly the same for Shopify Plus. So really understanding what that sales cycle is, understanding what the buying process is. So a lot of times on the marketing side, we go through the exercise of, figuring out who the people are, personas. We'll talk about that a little bit later, who all of the people in the buying process are. They make the decision, they're in, they decide to sign a contract, you get a verbal yes, but then there's a whole bunch of other things that happen, right? There's procurement. That could be a 6-month process, could be a year-long process. There's legal, there's finance, there's all of these other activities that happen on the enterprise sales side that we often don't take into account. There's a lot more stakeholders, right? So has anybody here ever read anything by Pat Spencer, the customer challenger or the challenger customer? No? Yeah? Highly recommend for anybody doing B2B mid-market to enterprise. Excellent book that actually breaks down all of the different possible stakeholders in this type of conversation. Now, it's not just the stakeholders, it's also blockers, right? We've all sold products where there's that one guy, usually a developer, that's like, no, we can't do this because of SEO or because of something else, right? So really understanding all of the people involved, whether they're involved in a positive way or a negative way. The unit economics obviously are very different than, I would say, a B2C model or even targeting small business, which tends to be more like B2C when you're looking at the growth mechanisms. It tends to be self-serve online. There's not usually a huge sales team involved. And my two favorite, pricing and product readiness. So pricing's a tricky one. How many people here have changed their pricing in the last 6 months? How many people have changed it in the last year? Same people for the most part. Last 2 years? Yeah, same people for the most part. So pricing is something that you need to iterate on, and pricing is something that it becomes more complex as you start to go up market. And when you're thinking of your pricing strategy, that actually ties into a lot of the other stuff we're doing today around how do we market and sell to those people. We'll dig more into that. And then the last thing is product readiness, right? So there are certain requirements that enterprise buyers are going to need from a product perspective. And I don't know why there's a blank slide there, but here's a slide that I was looking for. This I grabbed from Thomas Tunges, VC from Redpoint Ventures. Many of you have probably seen his blog. I would highly recommend checking this out because if you're actually looking at shifting up market, these are the different things that you need to look at from a product perspective. I don't want to spend a ton of time here because product is like a whole other session that you should probably have somebody on to talk about, but becoming quote-unquote enterprise ready is not a big thing. There are certain implications, things like single sign-on that a lot of enterprise want, things like user permissions that a lot of enterprise buyers want. So let's say you have all that. Let's say you even have sort of gone back to this list and you understand these things. You kind of have a sense for pricing. Yes, you're always going to go back and you're going to iterate, you're going to make these things better, you're going to optimize them. But what do you do now from a marketing and growth side? Well, the growth mechanisms are different in B2B. So how does this actually look? Now, before we get into tactics and before we get into the stuff that you need to do that's really essential in this type of marketing and growth levers, let's go back in time a little bit. Does everybody know what the innovation cycle is? No? Watch, I'm going to show you and you're going to be like, oh yeah. Yeah? Cool. So for those of you that haven't seen this, I recommend you read Crossing the Chasm, great book, old book, but good book, and the rules still apply. So here's where you really need to understand the type of technology that you're selling and where the market is in terms of actually adopting this technology, right? So let's say you're here. Let's say you guys are selling something super innovative and not a lot of people are using it. It's kind of a category creator. It's something that really not everybody fully understands. So a great example of this is when marketing automation started to become a thing. A lot of people were like, oh, what is that? Like, we don't even fully understand it. And now it's table stakes. Now it's a must-have. So these people at the beginning of this cycle, these people self-educate, right? These people are early adopters. These people are super excited about your product and your vision, and they're going to overlook your shitty software and all the bugs, okay? They're going to buy it anyway because they actually really believe in what you're doing. These people are different. These people are harder, right? These people need proof. These people need case studies. These people need validation. These people need the software to not be buggy, right? So these are the people that, as you start to scale as a company, this is often when you really start to hit your stride from a traction perspective and really start to generate growth, whether it's from a customer standpoint or from a revenue standpoint. And this is where a lot of the really critical elements of marketing at this level really come into play. So what are those critical elements? Well, I've bucketed them. We're going to dive into each of those buckets. One often overlooked element, and I think really the foundation of everything, is product marketing. We'll talk a little bit about that. I often have conversations with startups, and they're always like, I need to hire a marketer. I'm going to hire a content marketer or somebody to go be on Twitter or something along those lines. But most of the time, they should actually hire a product marketer first. Demand generation, we'll talk about that. Account-based marketing, we'll talk about that and how those things play off against each other. So, product marketing. This is actually quickly becoming one of my favorite topics. Largely because I'm in the middle of building out a product marketing team. Millie, who's on the Shopify Plus team right now, is laughing because I keep promising them I'm going to hire somebody and I haven't yet. But product marketing is the foundation. So let's actually quickly go through what that is. The funnel, pretty basic funnel, kind of oversimplified, right? So if we kind of go through this, there's certain things that happen, roughly speaking, at the top of the funnel. So we're looking at lead generation, maybe some content, maybe some SEO. We're trying to convert people here, so some conversion rate optimization. You're working with your sales team on actually getting some meetings set. And at the bottom is really where product marketing starts to come in. But just because it's at the bottom of the funnel doesn't mean it happens last, right? A lot of that stuff has to happen initially as a foundational element of your marketing strategy and feed back up into all of the other activities that you're doing in marketing. So when we talk about product marketing, it's around positioning. It's around understanding the market. It's around understanding the customer. At the heart of it, it's understanding the customer. And it's about taking that information and feeding it back into the other teams, feeding it into your sales team, feeding it into your success team, feeding it into your product team, and working with the marketing team to make sure that you're taking those messages and that you're working them into the rest of your marketing efforts. So that feedback loop is really integral to make sure that you're presenting your product in a way that's going to resonate with your customers, but it's not just one way, right? So you need to set that foundation, but then you also need the information from your growth team, from the person that's running ads, from the landing page conversion rate optimizer. I said that weird, sorry. But those people also need to feed back information into product marketing, so we know and we validate that that stuff is all working. Basic feedback loops. So product marketing kind of sits at the intersection of all the things, right? It sits between product, marketing, obviously, and sales, right? And it's a super cross-functional role, probably the most cross-functional role you will ever see because it has to make sure that everything is consistent across the board. So the other big question that I get is like, how do we know we're ready for product marketing? Because if you're a really early stage startup, how do you know? If you're scaling, when do you hire? So this handy little chart is going to tell you. This is actually from a blog post by First Round Capital. Great post. I would highly recommend you guys go check it out. I linked to it at the bottom there. But it's essentially a size versus complexity thing, right? So on the vertical axis, we've got size of the company. On the horizontal one, it's complexity. So if you're really small and you're a startup and your company's super, super simple, or your product rather is super simple, so the messaging isn't that complicated and isn't necessarily have to be that sophisticated, you don't need to necessarily hire someone right away, but you need to start to think of product marketing as a concept, right? So who's doing it? Probably the founder, or maybe the marketing generalist that you've probably hired, right? But the activities of product marketing still need to get done. Let's go up. Let's say you're a really large company, but the product is still pretty simple, right? Pretty easy to message. You need to hire somebody because that person needs to be responsible for taking all of that information and disseminating it throughout the organization, making sure it's consistent, making sure the positioning and the messaging is on point with where you guys want to be in the market, right? So let's go across. Let's say you're small, but you have a super complicated feature. I suspect this is where a lot of us sit if we're selling to enterprise, because not a lot of enterprise software is super simple, right? Most of us are selling software that's actually much more complex. And if you're still small and you're growing, product marketing becomes essential, particularly if you have a really complicated product. You need somebody whose full-time job it is to understand how to best explain that to people, especially if you're at the beginning of that curve, that innovation curve, where nobody really knows what it is you're trying to do, right? Really important that you have somebody focused on that and somebody that knows what they're doing. So if you're a founder and you don't actually know what you're doing, hire somebody that does. And then that top right corner, so this is kind of the position that I find myself in, like really big company, kind of a complicated product once you get to the enterprise level. It's a function, right? It's a team that needs to get built out because they have 40 sales hackers that they need to make sure are saying the right stuff to customers. They have 80 MSMs, which is the success team, and we have to make sure that they're updating people as new product comes out. They have a product team they need to deal with. So really understanding that. So what are some of the triggers that kind of let you know, okay, it's time to hire? So these are my oh shit moments. And I think we've probably all experienced a lot of them. And if you've experienced any of these, it's probably time to think about hiring a product marketer. So when you launch something and you're like, oh shit, we haven't actually priced this. How much should it cost? What plan should it go in? How many feel like you're nodding your head because that happens to you. Definitely happened to me a lot over the years. It's like this feature is about to launch and we haven't even really decided which customers get it, which plan it belongs to. Should we even be charging extra for it as an add-on? That discussion didn't happen until 3 days before the feature launched. It's probably time for a product marketer. Another oh shit moment. You're rewriting the email that should have probably gone out like a day ago and the product's already been released, but you really didn't have anybody to write it. It's probably time to like find somebody to do it. How many people have experienced that before? Yeah, pretty much everybody, I think. Your sales team is like, oh, I didn't know about this. How do I tell people about it? And it's not about understanding how the product works, it's about understanding what the value is for the customer. Your success team, same thing. They're like, oh, I didn't know about this. So what does a product marketer actually do? Well, this is like a topic in and of itself. Feel free to find me on SlideShare. I actually did a talk specifically on product marketing that goes way deeper into this, and the slides are there, so like feel free to dig into them. But just some of the stuff that product marketing ends up being responsible for is really toggling between strategic and tactical stuff. And it's a super tricky role because of that, because there's a really strong interplay between the two. Some of the more strategic elements are around market intelligence, so who are your competitors? I know sort of in the startup community, I feel like there's a lot of people here, we're often told to ignore your competition. You can't really do that when you have salespeople on the phone getting asked about your competition, right? You actually have to dig into it and understand what the differentiators are for your competition. And a lot of it too is around the positioning and the personas. We'll talk about positioning in a second and really what that means, but a lot of times those are things, positionings, personas, value props that are sort of said and they're kind of paid lip service to and they're considered very marketing-y, but they're actually essential for the growth of your product and your company. Oftentimes they have a hand in customer feedback. Different companies will take product marketing and go really deep into the product team, and some companies will treat product marketing as a thing where product kind of puts the product on the shelf and then product marketing takes it and takes it to market. I like a more integrated approach, so you really want those two teams working really closely together. Things like win-loss analysis for your sales team. So we lost a bunch of deals this month or this quarter or whatever it may be. Why? Who's on the phone with those customers? Who's understanding the product reasons for losing those deals? And who's actually giving that information back to your product team, right? So win-loss analysis, really, really powerful tool there to actually sit down and do. But keep in mind, in order to be able to do win-loss analysis, you have to be collecting all the right data, right? Which usually means you have to be relying on your sales team over there to enter all of the right data. So really work on those processes. And you know, things like market segmentation, if it makes sense for you. Things like go-to-market launches, so you're launching this feature, figuring out what kind of a launch is it? Triaging, hey, is this like a tier 1 launch where it's super important, we need to tell the world and do all the press releases and the landing pages and the marketing and the advertising? Or is this like a tier 2 thing where really customers should know because it's cool, but it's not like a press-worthy thing? Or is it tier 3 where it's the kind of product or feature that we really should have had anyway? So we're just going to put it in the support box, right? We've all had those. So really having somebody that can triage that stuff. And then of course the last phase, which I think is probably the often overlooked phase, where how do you actually drive product growth once the product's been released, right? So you have customers using it. How do you get them using it better? What are the success metrics? How do you measure adoption? How do you measure usage? What are the things that matter, right? So those all fall under the realm of product marketing. We're going to focus on 3 of those things today because these, I think, are the foundation that you need to do all the other stuff. If you don't have positioning, personas, and messaging, and I'll give you frameworks for all of those things, then well, I don't know what you're doing at the end of the day. So first one, positioning. Okay, so how many people here think positioning is a marketing thing? Okay. I'm going to actually challenge that and say that positioning is not a marketing thing. And in fact, marketing in general is way too important to be left to the marketing department, right? This is actually one of my favorite quotes, David Packard, co-founder of Hewlett-Packard. And really I take this to mean that marketing often will execute on this stuff, but they need to be taking inputs from everybody else. Marketing's easy if you listen and let other people tell you what it is you should be doing, Because at the end of the day, that's what it's all about. So positioning, in my mind, is a company-wide thing. It's not just a marketing thing. It's something that needs to be in the DNA of your entire company. So here's what usually happens when people do positioning stuff. They go online, they Google positioning, they get one of these like blank, like fill in the blank positioning statements. We've all seen them, right? It's like, we do this for this market and we differentiate based on blah blah, and you end up with this statement that's not English. Don't do that. Let's roll that back a little bit. So I actually reached out to my friend April Dunford. I think a lot of you know April. Yeah? Cool. So April talks a lot about positioning. If you get the chance, Google her. I'm sure there's something online. She talks about this really, really well. So I was like, April, send me your best definition of positioning. So this is what she sent me. Marketing is about making it easy for people to find, evaluate, and buy your products. Positioning is figuring out what your product is in the first place. Now, 2 minutes after she sent me this email, she emails me again and she's like, Hannah, wait, I have a better definition for you. She sends me this. So, marketing can polish a turd, positioning can turn turds into fertilizer. Totally true, right? Like, it's not just about making it shiny and running a bunch of ads against it. It's about changing how people think about your product. And that means changing the context surrounding your product. So, I think one of the most important things is context, and I think we have to take that concept and apply it to product. So, I mean, let's take this for example. What do you guys think I Googled to find this image? If you see me, you should do this slide before. You're not allowed to answer. Got any guesses?
Embarrassing moment.
Embarrassing moment.
Failure.
Sad man crying.
Lemon face.
Is usually what I get. Lemon face? I don't know what I would I don't know what I would get if I Googled lemon face. One guy at a conference once said constipated. Maybe he was constipated. But the reality is he's not sad at all. This is actually the happiest day of his life. Right? I think you suspected. And like, it's all about the context, right? I'm assuming this is the happiest day of his life. I'm assuming that I didn't misread the context. But context is everything. So when it comes to context and your product, what does that mean? So the context surrounding your product is made up of a variety of things, right? It's made up of pricing. We talked about that earlier. How you price your product, not just the actual sticker price, but your payment methods, the cadence in which people actually pay you, how you actually ask for money, right? Like, how many enterprise customers actually go in and like plunk in a credit card number? I have a ton of them. Maybe they should. Maybe we should try getting more of them to do that. But not a lot of them, particularly if it's hundreds of thousands of dollars in revenue in a year, right? There's a procurement process. There's an invoicing process. Your brand says something. That's part of the context, right? Your competitors, who your competitors are, say something about your context and your positioning in the market. And, of course, how you market, which channels you use, how your sales reps interact, that all contributes to your positioning in the market. So really thinking about what's the context that actually surrounds your product. This is particularly important in enterprise sales, where so much of it is perception. Why do you think people spend tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dollars to get on Gartner's Magic Quadrant? It's a perception thing, right? So this part is critical. The next piece is really the language that you use to talk about your product, and that's partly context as well, but I want to call this out because I think this is even more important. So it's not just the language you use to describe it or your sales team uses, it's also the language that your customers use to describe your product, and this is a little bit tricky. So when I was at Uberflip, I actually joined when they were like less than 20 people. We went through a phase where we had a bit of an identity crisis. We thought we were SMB. We turned out to be totally wrong. We shifted way up market. And then the customers were like Salesforce and Microsoft and DocuSign. And Schneider Electric, that's like a $3 billion company, right? And as we were making that shift, we really were revisiting all of this stuff, right? And one of the things that really we were trying to do is like that elevator pitch, right? Like what's the thing that we say so people know what it is that we do? So we're talking about this. Founder comes in, drops a founder bomb, as we've all seen, and he says, I've got it. We're a lightweight CMS for content marketers. Now, if you know what Uberflip does, that's actually kind of an accurate description, right? It's not a CMS in that it'll power your whole website, but it does integrate with WordPress, and sometimes it will actually replace WordPress. and it's a lot easier to use than a lot of the clunky enterprise systems. So it is technically correct. We're a lightweight CMS for content marketers. But let's break that down for a second. Keep in mind, we just shifted up market, right? We went from small business to enterprise buyers. We're a lightweight CMS for content marketers. Hi, we're a lightweight CMS for content marketers. Oh, CMS? We use WordPress. Click. That's what happens, right? Because people already have a preconceived idea of what a CMS is. And then we're like, no, wait, we're a different kind of CMS. Work with your CMS. Come back. It's not where you want to be. So that was problem number 1 with that statement. Problem number 2, we're a lightweight CMS for content marketers. What do you think enterprise buyers hear when they hear lightweight? Exactly. They hear shitty. They hear not robust enough for my big bad enterprisey need. They don't hear user-friendly and fun. That's what we hear as consumers, right? So lightweight was not the right phrasing there. So you can see just by changing the language, you're changing how people actually view your product, right? So really important to start to think about that. Now, this is my slide where this is going to tell you what to do and how to do it. I'm not going to stay here really long. This is a worksheet slide. This is from April. Go fill this out. Try to fill it out. You'll probably have a hard time initially. But these are the things that you need to start to put in place as you build out that positioning. Now, positioning isn't messaging. Positioning fuels messaging. Positioning is for you internally to understand where you sit in the market, right? Positioning is to solve the identity crisis that most startups have at some point, particularly if you're moving up market like we did at Uberflip. So, next big piece, personas. Personas, again, I think are often misunderstood. I'm going to go through this part pretty quickly because I feel like the people in this room have a good idea of like what these are and how to do it. But just to emphasize the importance, this is actually one of my favorite quotes. Brian Halligan from HubSpot. He's talking about when HubSpot went from startup to scale up. So when did they really get traction? When did they really start to see that hockey stick growth? And it was really when they nailed down one persona and started to focus on it. And he says that by not deciding on a single persona initially, they create a gigantic, invisible optionality tax. When they shifted and they decided to focus on Marketing Mary was the persona that they decided to focus on, everything changed because they oriented the whole company to Marketing Mary, right? Product was building for Marketing Mary. Sales was selling to Marketing Mary. Marketing was marketing to Marketing Mary. Too many marketings there. But you see how that makes such an impact, especially in the early days as you're trying to get traction. Now, you definitely get to a point where, I mean, HubSpot's IPO now, they're big, so it may make sense to start to segment and target other markets, other verticals, but where are you going to get the biggest bang for your buck, especially initially? So remember that people and personas are multifaceted. You really want to think about segmenting your audience and your market, as well as looking at the individual personas, and start to get creative in how you do that. So we talked earlier about how size isn't necessarily the best way to segment your market. It's just one dimension. So what are some other ways you can actually take a look at your personas, but also the different segments? So there's pretty basic stuff, right? Demographic information. This is actually really easy to get now online. If you have an email address, this is pretty easy to get. This stuff tends to be a little bit trickier, right? Some of the behavioral stuff. Like, what are they searching for? How are they interacting on social? What kind of engagement is there with your content, with your website, with your email, right? And even beyond that, looking at some of the external signals, or going into your product and looking at some of the product signals. And then there's the other category, right? So segmenting on things based like technology usage. That's one thing we actually did at Uberflip that worked really well because we integrated with marketing automation tools. So we actually segmented our contacts by which marketing automation tool they used. Some of them use Marketo, some of them use Pardot, some of them use HubSpot. That allowed us to be way more targeted in our outreach because Marketo people talk different languages than, or one different language than HubSpot people. In one database, they're contacts, in another one, they're leads, right? So understanding what the most impactful and relevant ways to target is. That might be industry, it might not be, right? It might be based on technology, it might be based on their marketing spend, right? If you have a company that's spending a lot of money on marketing, that's indicative that marketing is something that they value. That means that, hey, maybe they're willing to invest in marketing technology. So start to think outside the box with stuff like this and really start to understand what is this segment that you're targeting and the properties with that segment, and then how do those personas fit into that? How do you start to reach out to those personas? So I'm going to skip this slide because I feel like you guys know this stuff, but you can go back and look at this if you understand how to get that. It's pretty easy to get some of this data. It gets a little trickier to get the other data. What I want you to think about is not just the personas, but also like who's the decision maker and who's the influencer, and also think about who's the buyer persona and who's the user persona, right? Because oftentimes, particularly in the enterprise space, the buyer, the dude that makes the decision and signs the contract, is not the person actually in the product, right? So that's really important to understand, and you need both, right? All right, guys, messaging. So we'll go through this really quickly, but when you're looking at messaging, this is the framework that I like to use. What is your big why? What is the thing people care about the most? From there, you can usually thread out some secondary messaging that works. And then let's take a look at an example. So Netflix actually might look something like this. That's entertainment straight to your device. You've got some secondary messaging there. It's great content. It gives you a recommendation. It's convenient. It's cheap. But then you need proof. Then you need a product story. Then you need the content to back that up, right? Now, this makes it look super linear, and it doesn't necessarily work that way, right? You can thread together different narratives for a lot of these different messages, but start to think about really defining what those value props are. I love how Millie's shaking her head yes, because I literally did this at Shopify. So for a startup, it might look something like this, right? And understand that this doesn't mean the thing that you create here, the messaging, this is a foundational doc. So out of that doc, you can spin up 100 different types of landing pages, right, based on the market segmentation that you do. And really think about the right message, but also the right message for the individual. And from here, guys, take that and create derivatives of that messaging. Start to test, start to think about driving growth through really targeted ways. So, I don't know, dynamic landing pages, right? Starting to look at things like really targeted email nurture or onboarding based on taking those messages and actually correlating them to the right person that they're attached to. But in order to do that stuff, what do you need? Positioning, personas, and messaging, right? In order to do any of that cool growth stuff. So product marketing, I know I've talked about it a lot, but I think it really is a critical element. Demand gen, I mean, at the core of demand gen, it's about driving growth. But what is actually demand generation? So the big question I get is like, how is demand gen different from marketing? Does everybody know how demand gen is different from marketing? No? Kinda? Sorta? Yeah? Because it sounds like marketing. So like lead generation, qualified prospects, optimizing conversion through the buying cycle, sort of sounds like marketing, right? Kind of is marketing. The caveat that I would say for demand generation, even though that definition is sort of like, what? Is that demand gen is often applied in a B2B context and often in an enterprise context. And the trick that demand gen usually has is they have to actually move people from that innovation piece up that curve, right? And they have to educate people about software that they weren't even necessarily thinking of buying. They have to generate the demand for your product and service. And it could be that your product or service is naturally going there, and that's where the market is evolving, but how do we start to educate people on that? HubSpot did a great job of this initially, right? They created inbound as this thing that's like this movement now. It wasn't like that before. They made it a thing. They generated the demand. So that is the difference between demand generation specifically, in my mind, and just kind of looking at marketing a little bit more generally. So for demand generation, you want to focus where your people are. I'm not going to dig into this. I feel like you guys know how to do a lot of this stuff. Content, right, is a huge driver of demand gen. Partner marketing, co-marketing worked really well for us at Uberflip. The key there is overlap between audience and alignment on topic. If you don't have those things, don't do it. The thing that I see startups do is one startup will partner with another startup, and neither of them has any customers, so why, right? So really make sure that the partner marketing and the co-marketing you're doing makes sense. Obviously, organic, and SEO is still a thing. Don't ignore it, please. And then some paid if it makes sense for you. And really understanding, are people ready to buy? So one of the things that we actually did at Uberflip that worked well for lead generation is syndicated content, right? But you have to understand what the experience is for people for the appropriate follow-up. And this really is applicable to any channel that you're using, but if we look at it from the perspective of that channel, it was really around like, are they ready to buy? If yes, then it's more acquisition focused, and we hand it off to sales right away. But If no, then there's a lot of education that's required and a lot of follow-up that's required. So you really want to make sure you take a more content-focused approach and really nurture them from the perspective of giving them the value from a content perspective. So just because you syndicate a piece of content and they download an ebook or a white paper, like, understand where they're actually downloading that from. If they're downloading it from your own website and it's like highly related to the product and it's like, how do I, build purple elephants, and your product helps build purple elephants, then yeah, they're sales ready, right? Send them to sales. But if they downloaded a piece of content that's a little bit more top funnel and it was syndicated on somebody else's site, even though it's your content and you got the leads, they probably don't actually know who you are, right? Because they got that content somewhere else. So they need a little bit more education, a little bit nurture. So really pay attention to that across the board in demand gen. Account-based marketing. How many people here are doing account-based marketing? Yeah? How many people want to do account-based marketing? How many people are pumped about it? Okay, cool. How many people know who John Miller is? Cool. So John Miller actually has been coining the term recently, account-based everything, as opposed to account-based marketing. So I'm totally stealing it from him. John was the co-founder of Marketo. He's now the co-founder or the founder of a company called Engagio, which specializes in account-based marketing. And the reason I want to stick with account-based everything is because account-based marketing is the only marketing thing, really, that marketing can't do in a silo. You can't just randomly target accounts, right? There has to be a really concerted and coordinated effort with your sales team, even with your leadership team if it's really strategic. So when does it actually make sense to do ABM? Well, it depends, right, is going to be my response. So if it's a really sort of big fish that you're literally trying to catch and you know exactly who they are, ABM makes sense, right? If it's like the Fortune 500, you know exactly who your customer list is going to be, who your ideal list is going to be. If it's super, super niche, so if you're building a product for, HR orgs in billion-dollar companies, you know exactly who it is you're targeting, right? So there are certain indicators that will tell you whether or not it's a good thing to do. But regardless of how far up market you're doing, you always want to be measuring net new accounts, right? And the reason I say that is because even if you're more mid-market, even if a lot of the heavier ABM tactics might not make sense for you because they are time-consuming and expensive to do in many, many cases, you always want to be measuring net new accounts. And we'll talk a little bit about the importance on that, but really it's around making sure you've always got that influx, because if you have a database and you have 38 leads from Macy's, that doesn't mean 38 deals for your sales team, right? That probably means one, maybe two, depending if it's different divisions. So really understanding how to forecast pipeline based on not only leads, but also accounts that are in your database. So it comes down to customers, it comes down to, is it a really niche industry? And also, what are your unit economics and does it make sense? So if you Google account-based marketing, you'll probably get some sort of paradigm like this. I generally like this model because it really helps you understand how much you should invest in ABM. And generally speaking, the more niche and the bigger the deal size, the further up you go, right? So if you're doing really strategic ABM and it's one-to-one marketing and you're creating like content for specific companies and you're doing a lot of biz dev, that's a targeted account approach that should really be led from the sales org, right? And really understanding who it is that sales is selling to. And as you go down, you can do sort of ABM light, and that's really segmentation, right? That's really looking at different market segments. And you go down even further, that's segmentation on a bigger level, and that's really automating a lot of the stuff around those different segments. So make sure that if you're doing account-based marketing, there's alignment on all of the key accounts. So marketing is aligned with sales, is aligned with the executive team, and also make sure that the outreach is coordinated, the experience is consistent. So I have a couple more slides just around like funnel, because I feel like this is something that a lot of people don't really pay attention to. And then I'll wrap it up. It's like 2 more minutes, I promise. But basically when you're looking at your funnel, that's something that tends to evolve over time as a company matures, right? And when I look at sort of the 3 phases of evolution for a startup, I kind of see them going through sort of 3 distinct phases. The first phase is what I call the Wizard of Oz phase. So you're kind of following the yellow brick road, good things are happening, but don't look behind the curtains because it's a fucking shit show, right? There's no process, nobody actually knows what they're doing, right? You probably don't really know where your customers are coming from, and that's where usually you're at when you're a startup. And then you move into what I call the Scooby-Doo phase. So you're starting to hire people, you're kind of starting to build out some processes. You generally solve the mystery, but you're still kind of bumbling around like idiots a little bit, right? And incidentally, this happens in big companies too, if they're building teams from scratch that never existed before. So this isn't just startups, this is really across the board. And then of course, there's the Ocean's 11 space, which is like, it's a highly specialized team, they're super coordinated, they're executing left, right, and center. I feel like this doesn't exist really, but it's more of an aspirational phase. But really, generally speaking, those are the phases that you go through. And your operations model and your funnel tends to go through those phases as well. So when you're first starting, you're probably pretty sales focused, particularly if you're selling into bigger companies, and you should be. Those are the people that should be validating your sales. Don't try marketing stuff until you sell shit, right? And this is probably your funnel. Like, I have a lead, and I'm turning them into a customer. Then maybe you get a little bit more sophisticated, right? I have a lead, but now I have some mechanisms in place to start to qualify those leads, and then we're turning them into a customer. And then maybe you actually start to build it out a little bit more. You have a lead, you have a qualified lead, you have some way to pass them off to sales. Sales says, yeah, these are good, I'm gonna follow up. Sales qualifies them and then takes them through a buying process in order to actually sell them the product, right? So that's typically the way it goes. This is pretty, I think, straightforward if you're in B2B. There's a lot of things that happen at the top of the funnel around data, programs, nurture, etc. Mid-funnel is really around the lead qualification and the management. Sales enablement kind of happens in that area as well. And then, of course, we're looking at customer marketing and sales. Notice that product marketing, elements of product marketing, threads through all of those things, right? So again, hire a product marketer or do it yourself. Really, really, really important. And then, of course, remembering that it's kind of bi-directional. So people don't just linearly go down your funnel. They kind of bounce up and down a little bit. So understand where people are at and what the feedback mechanisms are to, for example, if somebody gets down partway through the funnel and they're, you know, it's not the right time, they're not really as qualified as we thought yet, how do we kick them back up into marketing, right? So they don't just go dead and cold somewhere. And then, of course, understanding the key metrics for marketing. Depending on your model, you're not necessarily going to look at all of these, but you're going to want to look at some of these. So marketing qualified leads, of course. Marketing qualified accounts, maybe, right? But don't think that leads don't matter, right? There's this thing at ABM right now. There's a lot of hype around it, and you'll hear a lot of people being like, oh, leads don't matter. It's all about accounts. Leads matter, right? So at the end of the day, it's people within those accounts. So you do need to be looking at both. What's your MQL to opportunity? And by opportunity, I mean somebody's having a meaningful conversation with sales about buying the product. What's the conversion rate there? What's the conversion rate on an account level, so your MQA? And then, of course, how much pipeline is marketing generating? If you're not measuring dollars in from marketing, not necessarily closed, yeah, you want to do that, but you also want to measure how much actual pipeline, potential deals marketing is generating. That's incredibly important as well. And to do that, you need to look at accounts, right? Not just leads. Go back to that Macy's example. It's one account, but there's like 38 leads in the database for it. So the accounts is what's going to give you that pipeline forecast. And then, of course, as you're working with sales, it's around qualifying, understanding what the qualifying criteria is. So what is a qualified lead? How do we hand them off? And then how do we start to optimize that? So you're probably saying that's a lot of process. Kind of is a lot of process, right? A lot of marketing is just a lot of process. And I just want to cap off by talking about this a little bit because there's like this perception, I think, in a lot of startups where process is bad. And process isn't bad. Process is actually rhythm, right? And what good process does is it actually lets you and your team get into a rhythm and a cadence so you can actually get stuff done more efficiently, better, etc. And rhythm, at the end of the day, means less stress for people, right? So just a quick word on process, like definitely keep it simple. And a good process is one that people are actually going to follow. So if there are processes in place but nobody's following them, they're bad. Rip them out, right? Simplify them. And then, of course, break it when necessary. There are times to follow process and there are times to break process and make sure everybody understands that that's okay. And the reality is, all of the stuff we covered today needs a really strong operational foundation and a really strong ability to come in and processize all of those functions. Cool? Awesome. That's it. Thanks, guys. Questions? Yeah, for sure. I don't know who has their hand up first. Do you want to go?
Sure. When seeking that big enterprise sale, I'm interested in your perspective on the tension between focusing on the big executive decision maker versus seeking sort of a
like bottom-up approach.
groundswell bottom-up approach. I mean, probably there's going to be
like
some of both, but
B2B.
where do you have a bias towards? You know, a lot of times the sales team, it's just like, just go for the kill, go for the big guy, and the marketers will say, well, no, because we've got to build this ground up. What's your take on that?
Well, that's a hard question. So I think a couple things. So I think it depends on the product and the market to a degree. I almost feel like if I were in a scenario where I was in an early startup, I'd want to try and test both, right? Because depending on the kind of product, you might actually get a lot of traction going ground up, like more of a B2C to B, did I say that right, type model. Really great example of that is Expensify, right? So they went in and they just did expense reporting, made it easy for employees, and then they sold in to, and like Dropbox is another example. Like there's a bunch of examples. But in other scenarios, other companies have seen super success just going straight up to the executive. I would say try both. I would say see what kind of traction you get. I would also say that you probably need to do a little bit of both anyway, because when the big executive goes to his person on this team that's doing the stuff and says, hey, what do you think of this? They should know about it, at least, right? So there should be some awareness at both levels, I think. I don't know if that answers your question at all.
Yeah, I think
it is and it depends.
Totally. It's a fair answer. I don't think there's a
I feel like you wouldn't tell me if you didn't like the answer. You'd be like, no, I didn't like that. Any other questions? Yeah.
I've got a product that's got the word lightweight in the title.
Yeah.
So I'm excited with this part of the positioning, right?
Okay.
Yeah, I never thought about what enterprise customers really think when they
think about that.
Yeah. So you mentioned that Uberflip had that kind of problem as well.
Yeah.
So what kind of things did you do to move on that?
Oh man, we tested a bunch of things, and even now, like they're still sort of testing and iterating on it. I think the latest iteration was like something around owning the buyer journey, which makes sense if we're talking to the right person because they understand what that means. So it's around like content for the full buyer journey and content at scale. I think that's where they ended up. But we went through a bunch of iterations, right? And I do, and let me correct that by saying like I do think it's a fine balance. Like, okay, maybe you don't want to use like lightweight, but I also think there's a huge opportunity in enterprise growth and mid-market to differentiate because there's a lot of shit out there, right? And a lot of jargony speak and a lot of like overly corporate, overly technical stuff. So really find the balance between like making sure that you project the gravitas and the seriousness of your product while still retaining the humanity and the language with which you use. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I think I have to
it's hard to do.
Yeah.
It's super hard to do. Any other questions?
I got a question. I've heard that ABM should be approached by companies that have a lifetime value over 30K.
Yeah.
Do you agree with that? Do you have a threshold for which it makes it worth it?
Different people will give you different thresholds. So like John, the last time I talked to him, said, 100K ACV, which is substantially higher. I think it depends on what kind of ABM we're talking about, right? Because the reality is like there's a bunch of like tools right now that let you do some targeting for fairly cheap and fairly easy. So I think it's just that balance of like whatever ABM stuff that you're doing. So like you can do, for example, you can do account-based advertising, right? So instead of doing like remarketing at the lead level, you can do essentially remarketing but for like the company. So I want to show display ads for all of Microsoft and like specifically these roles within Microsoft. That's not necessarily that expensive to do, right? So if the ABM tactics you're using line up with the unit economics, then I would say go for it. But I would also say that sometimes there's a lot of time and effort that's put into that stuff. And I mean, we've run experiments in the past where we tried to do some account-based advertising, and we compared that cohort with like another cohort that we just ran basic stuff on, like the status quo, and we saw no difference. So I think it just really depends on your market and what you're doing. Yeah. Yeah.
Is there a way to combine messaging that is going to create a sense of urgency while at the same time, if you're selling to a market that's not highly educated in what you're selling, it's going to build kind of awareness as well?
So you want to educate them and tell them to buy right now?
Yeah.
Okay. So both of those things. Sure, no problem. I think that's tough. I think to create urgency, like it really does have to be like a must-have and a critical problem. And I think to do that, you have to figure out like intent, because usually if people are actively searching a solution to a specific problem, there's like intent there to take action, and that's like low-hanging fruit, right? Like don't try to create urgency where you're going to be like fighting an uphill battle. Find the people that are like there's intent there and that you know that they need that problem solved. And then in parallel, educating the market overall so that you have that longer tail kind of lead gen funnel. It's hard to do both, particularly if it's kind of a new category and people aren't really sure what it is or what the value is. B2B, SaaS is really hard. Like, and I've done B2C and I've done like a little bit of marketplace. Marketplace is also really hard. But B2B SaaS is tough because bigger companies are only going to buy so much software. Right? So it actually doesn't matter that the team you're talking to really likes your software. It doesn't matter, right? Is it enough of a must-have for them to spend dollars on it? And that's really tricky to start to figure out.
Very often they don't even know the requirement, right? So you first have to educate. There's no scope for getting an emergency into it.
Totally, and they don't know it's a problem oftentimes until you point it out. And a really good indicator of that is like sit on all the sales calls, right, and craft that message. And until you get to the point where you're on a sales call and the rep is going through like the messaging that's like appropriate for that person should be like, oh yes, yep, like I have all of those problems. Until you get there, like you need to keep iterating. Yeah, for sure. Any other questions? Yeah.
When you went up market at Uberflip, was there some big aha, something you learned that you wish you knew going in, like a big mistake you made or a big discovery that you could have?
I wish we had ripped off the Band-Aid and just went straight up market much quicker. So we did this weird thing where we did it slowly. Seemed like a good idea at the time. Where it's like we had a $50 price point, we slashed that, but we kept our like $200 price point. And then like 500, and then like 5,000, and then like we basically moved up market in like slow increments. I actually think like hindsight, obviously being 2020, we probably should have just ripped the Band-Aid off. Like we had already identified that the unit economics are better here, usage is better here, churn is less here, like all of this stuff that comes with coming up market. And don't get me wrong, there's a lot of challenges going up market as well, but like this was just a much more attractive thing, and we were already getting like customer pull. So when we shifted up market, it was really like, oh, we were sort of opportunistically selling to some of these people, and then we're like, what if we just focus all our efforts there? And it's too hard to do both, right? So the smaller price points and the SMB, that's a different funnel. That was like a self-serve funnel where they're signing up online, free trial, upgrade, etc. But then you had to build out a marketing and sales engine, totally different things, and it's really hard to really focus on both, particularly if this one doesn't necessarily lead into that. So there's some models where you can get people in through like a self-serve funnel, but then there's an opportunity to upsell. That wasn't the case with Uberflip. So I would say that, you know, if you have identified that that's the right move, like double down on it, like in one step, right? Cool. Any other questions?
Just one more question. I didn't hear you talk about your team, specifically with regards to bringing in somebody like a developer in your team.
Yeah.
Is there a specific stage within the innovation process or the funnel that you think would be most important to
bring in specifically a developer?
It's specifically for your marketing team.
For the marketing team. Yeah, I mean, the earlier the better, depending on what you're trying to do. So like team structure and team org is I think a little bit different in every company. like if you can have dedicated resources earlier, I think like the earlier the better on the marketing side. I think also like it just depends on your model. So I'm a big fan of having all of that stuff in-house. I don't like outsourcing any Fed work or any real developer work. So if you can pull it all in-house, but yeah, I don't know. The sooner the better is my answer. Cool. Anything else? Yeah.
Typically with B2B audiences, they're quite small.
Yeah.
And especially if you're targeting specific roles.
Totally.
So I find that within like sometimes a week I can saturate the audience and get that message out really quick.
Yeah.
So how do you deal with that frequency? And do you expand vertically to different channels, or do you keep on hitting those same people just with different messaging, or what do you think the best approach is?
Yes. Maybe all of those things.
Okay. Do you think it's okay to hit
Yeah.
the same audience over and over with 20 messages? Or 20 pieces of content?
I feel like you'll get indicators if you've gone too far.
Okay.
That's a tough one because, so like let's take email for example.
Yeah.
I think actually people are often really afraid of sending too many emails, and there definitely can be a point to that, but I've often found that you can actually probably send a lot more than you think you can. So like, you know, for a while at Uberflip we were sending it daily, and the open rates were great, and the click-through rates were great because people are almost trained to get stuff from you.
Yeah.
So it also depends on your audience, I think. It depends on the quality of the stuff that you're sending out. I think if there's value there, yeah, I don't think frequency should really be an issue. And if you do go overboard, they'll tell you, like you'll get pushback, right? Particularly on something like email. And then depending on how you're targeting, so like if you're targeting a particular role across many verticals, there's sort of that horizontal targeting, but then you can go deep within verticals and start to saturate those a little bit more as well.
Okay. So it's okay to up the frequency? It's not
I would try it, yeah.
Okay.
I feel like I'm gonna get him in trouble with that.
Well, what I noticed is a campaign will run for 7 days and
Yeah.
then instantly stop. So basically everyone has seen it. It's a binary yes or no, I like this.
Right.
And then so I hit them up with a different message,
Yeah.
and then again you segment up that audience saying yes.
Yeah.
Then you segment.
And it sounds like you're really finding like message match with those audience, right?
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
part of the audience has different needs and different goals.
Totally, yeah.
So I guess they'll resonate better with specific messages. So I guess.
Yeah, I think that's a great approach.
Okay.
Cool.
One last question. What's the right profile if you want to hire a product marketer?
Yeah.
What's the right profile for someone like that? Because it's not.
Christy's laughing because it's really hard to hire a product marketer.
Really hard to hire.
Like really, really hard to hire. If any of you want to go into product marketing, you totally should because it's a really hard hire and everybody needs them. So I've seen two types of product marketers really kind of emerge. You can get product marketers that come up through marketing, right? And you can get product marketers that come up through product and actually are a little bit more technical in their understanding. And I think that depending on the nature of your product, you might want to lean one way or the other, right? If it is a really, really, really technical product and needs to be messaged and explained that way to a technical audience, having somebody come up from more of a technical background might make sense. Otherwise, having somebody come up from a marketing background makes sense. And in terms of like the skills, it's like it's all the things. So they need to be a really, really good storyteller because they're weaving together the narrative of your company and your product, right? They also need to be a really good project manager because they're working cross-functionally across a bunch of different teams. And they need to really want to dive into the research and the data because they're going to be the ones that fuel all of that stuff to the other teams, and also have that sort of product growth component where you know they're measuring success metrics like product usage and that kind of stuff. So it's a hard role. I'm
considering
Yeah.
moving somebody internally from customer success to that role.
That's a great move.
But they don't have any sort of training, any hard credentials.
From a marketing standpoint?
For product marketing.
For product marketing? I would say actually that's a really good lateral move. You'll have to train them on the marketing stuff, but I feel like the marketing stuff is like teachable in a lot of cases. So if you think that's somebody that could learn, I think that's a great person because there's no ramp up on products, right?
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, like it's all about understanding the customer, and if they're on success, they definitely do. Yeah. Cool. Thanks, guys.
Okay.